I heard
You've
the
got to
pops
move
before I
these.
saw the
I'm not
damage.
moving them.
Sharp, rapid,
Just
one
5
after
minutes.
another,
Absolutely
like
not.
something
Get off my
tearing through
property.
rubber on
Now.
purpose. And by the time my truck rolled to a stop, the front left tire was already sagging into the gravel, hissing like it was giving up. I stepped out, boots crunching on the
Welcome,
driveway I'd
neighbors.
walked since I
Just a
was a
reminder
kid,
regarding
and
our
that's when
new
I
lawn
saw it.
maintenance
Thin
guidelines.
strips of metal
I have the
teeth laid
documents
across
here
the
for
only
review,
path to my
but you
cabin,
can't just put that
catching
up
the
without a
sunlight
hearing.
just
We
enough to
followed
look
protocol.
intentional,
Your structure
not
violates the
debris.
setback
Nodded.
lines.
Sir, the
Accident,
notice is
but a
valid. Work
warning.
must cease
I crouched
immediately.
down, picked one up, felt
they
the
coming
cold
in?
bite of steel against my fingers, and for a second I just stared at
Copy
it,
that.
trying to
Moving now.
understand how someone thought they could
Looks
turn
like
my own
everything's back in
property into
order.
a trap.
Yes, it
The
does.
air smelled
Thanks for
faintly
taking
like
care of
hot
this so
rubber and
quickly.
dust, and somewhere in the trees a generator hummed low, steady, like it had always been there even though I knew it hadn't. I looked up, and that's when the second hit landed, not in sound, but in sight. A gate, brand new. Heavy steel bars anchored into concrete that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, stretched across my driveway about 30 yards ahead, and bolted right into posts that cut clean across my boundary line. Hanging from the center was a sign, white background, bold black letters like they were proud of it. Private HOA property. No unauthorized access. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it didn't make sense. Like reading a sentence where the words were right, but the meaning was wrong. This cabin sits on just under 6 acres in the foothills outside Denver. Land my grandfather bought in 1968 with money he saved hauling lumber, land that passed to my dad. Then to me. Every transfer recorded, stamped, filed. Real, legal, untouchable. And yet here I was, standing on that same ground, staring at a sign telling me I didn't belong. I took a few steps forward, careful now, watching for more of those spikes, and noticed something else. Cameras, small, black, mounted high on the new posts, angled down toward the driveway like eyes that had been waiting for me to show up. Whoever did this wasn't guessing. They were watching. A breeze pushed through the pines, carrying the smell of fresh-cut wood and something chemical. Sealant, maybe. New construction smell. Recent. Deliberate. I reached the gate and wrapped my hand around the chain, gave it a pull, felt how solid it was, how permanent it was meant to be, and that's when a voice cut through the quiet behind me. Calm, almost amused. "You're going to want to stop right there," he said, and I didn't need to turn around to know exactly who it was. Victor Hale had that kind of voice, the kind that carried authority even when it didn't belong to him. I turned anyway, slow, steady, and there he was standing a few yards back on my driveway like he owned the angle of the sunlight itself. Pressed shirt, clean boots that had never seen real work, holding a folder like it was a weapon. He gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes and nodded toward the sign like he was proud of it. "This area's been annexed into the community," he said, like he was explaining something simple to someone who just didn't get it. I looked from him to the gate, to the spikes, to the cameras, then back to him, and felt something settle in my chest. Not panic, not anger, something quieter, heavier, because in that moment I realized this wasn't a mistake, it wasn't confusion, it was a move. Someone had drawn a line across my land and expected me to step back. What Victor didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that every inch of this place, every boundary marker, every recorded document, every quiet detail he thought he could ignore, was about to matter more than he ever imagined. I did not raise my voice, and I did not step back. I just held his gaze and let the silence stretch long enough to make him feel it. Because men like Victor always do. They cannot stand quiet when they think they are in control. The wind shifted again, pushing dust across the gravel, and I could hear the faint ticking of my cooling engine behind me, steady, patient, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. Victor adjusted the folder in his hand and took a few steps closer, careful to stay on his side of the gate, like he understood lines when they benefited him. "There was a vote," he said, tapping the papers. "Community expansion, improved. Access, long overdue." And he said it with that polished tone people use when they believe paperwork can rewrite reality. I glanced at the hinges, the welds, the fresh concrete still darker than the surrounding ground, then back to him, and asked one simple question. "Who gave you access to pour footings on private land?" And his smile tightened just a fraction, not gone, just recalibrated. He flipped open the folder and held up a printed map, bright colors, clean lines, my property shaded in. The same tone as the subdivision behind him, like it had always been part of it. According to this survey, this parcel falls within our jurisdiction, he said, and for a moment I just looked at it, not because I believed it, but because I recognized it. I had seen that map before, or at least a version of it, months ago when the county released a preliminary zoning overlay that never passed final review. It was a proposal, not a record, and the difference between those two things is the difference between suggestion and law. I stepped closer to the gate, close enough to see the edges of the print, the faint watermark of a third-party drafting company, not the county seal, and that quiet, heavy feeling in my chest settled deeper, sharper now, because this was not just overreach. This was built on something incomplete, something they hoped nobody would check. You are enforcing a draft, I said, calm, even, and I watched his eyes for that flicker, that moment when confidence meets doubt. And there it was, small but real. He recovered quickly, of course, straightening his shoulders, shifting his weight like the ground belonged to him. It will be finalized, he said, and there it was again, that assumption, that inevitability he thought he could lean on. Behind him, I noticed another detail I had missed at first, one of the original survey markers, the metal stake that should have been 30 feet to the west, was now sitting just inside the line he had claimed, its top freshly scraped, dirt still loose around the base. Someone had moved it, not by accident, not by erosion, but by hand. I walked over, slow, deliberate, crouched down, and pressed my boot against the soil. Felt how soft it still was, how recently it had been disturbed, then stood back up and looked straight at him. You relocated a county marker, I said, and this time his smile did not come back right away. For a second, just a second, the air between us changed, less certain, more fragile, like a structure that had not been set properly. He cleared his throat, glanced at the cameras, then back at me. You are trespassing, he said, louder now, like volume could replace accuracy. And if you do not leave, I will have security escort you off community property. And that was the moment everything clicked into place, not because of what he said, but because of what he did not understand. I straightened, brushed the dust off my hands, and took one last look at the gate, the spikes, the sign, every piece of this setup they had rushed to make permanent, and I realized they had built their entire claim on something temporary, something that would not survive a single real review. I nodded. Once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, then turned back toward my truck, stepping carefully between the strips of metal they had laid out, already mapping out what needed to happen next. Because if they wanted to turn this into a legal boundary, then I was going to make sure the law showed up. And when it did, it was not going to be quiet. I did not drive far, just enough to clear the curve where the trees opened up and the cabin disappeared from view. And then I pulled over, killed the engine, and sat there with my hands resting on the wheel, listening to the quiet settle back in like nothing had happened, like my property had not just been turned into someone else's project. The smell of overheated rubber still lingered faintly, mixing with pine and dust, and I let it sit there, let it remind me exactly how deliberate this had been. I reached over, grabbed my phone, and opened the folder I had not touched in months, the one labeled with the county parcel number, the one most people would not think to keep, because most people never need to prove something that obvious. Scans of the original deed, clean and stamped, transfer records from my father to me, survey diagrams with exact measurements down to the inch, and then the one document I knew mattered more than all the rest, the recorded access easement filed in 1972, granting permanent ingress and egress along that exact driveway Victor had just blocked with his gate. I zoomed in on the seal, the county clerk's signature, the recording number, every detail that made it real, enforceable, not a proposal, not a draft, but law. I took a screenshot, then another, building a small stack of proof in my camera roll, not because I needed to convince myself, but because I knew exactly who would need to see it next. The clock on the dash read 2:14 p.m., and I remember thinking how quiet everything felt compared to what was about to happen. I opened my email, started a new message, and typed in 3 addresses I had worked with before on infrastructure permits: the County Land Records Office, Code Enforcement, and the Sheriff's Administrative Line. Not emergency, not dramatic, just the channels that move things. When something crosses from private dispute into public violation, I attached the documents one by one, each file loading with a small progress bar that felt slower than it should have. Then I started writing, keeping it simple, factual, No emotion, no accusations, just a sequence of verifiable statements. Unauthorized installation of physical barriers on recorded easement, relocation of official survey marker, deployment of roadway hazards on private access route, all supported by attached documentation. I paused for a second, then added one more line. The kind that does not raise its voice but changes how a message is read, requesting immediate review due to potential safety risk and unlawful obstruction of recorded access. And I knew that phrase would land exactly where it needed to. I hit send and watched the message disappear into that quiet digital space where decisions begin. Then I opened another app, scrolled to the live feed from the camera mounted on the old pine near the bend in the driveway, the one Victor had not noticed because it was not new, not obvious, just part of the land like everything else he thought he could rearrange. The image came into focus, steady, clear, showing the gate, the spikes, the sign, all of it documented from an angle that left no room for interpretation. I scrubbed back through the footage, found the moment from earlier that morning when a truck rolled in, workers stepping out, carrying posts, unspooling chain, laying down those metal strips like they were marking territory, and I saved that clip too. The pieces were lining up now, not in a rush, not in anger, but in order, the way they always do when you let facts do the work. I leaned back in the seat, closed my eyes for just a second, and pictured Victor standing there behind that gate, holding his folder like it made him untouchable, and I almost felt sorry for him, because he thought this was about control, about drawing a line and enforcing it. But what he had really done was create a record, a clean, undeniable sequence of actions that would not need interpretation, only review. I opened my eyes, looked back toward the trees where my cabin sat just out of sight, and let the thought settle in, quiet and certain, because I had seen this pattern before on job sites, on contracts, on disputes that looked complicated until the right document showed up. They had built something they could not support, and now all I had to do was give the right people 48 hours to look at it. The first response came faster than I expected, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet vibration in my pocket about 12 minutes after I sent the email. I glanced down at my phone and saw the subject line preview from County Land Records, short, direct, received, reviewing documentation. And that was all I needed to know that this had already moved beyond Victor and his gate. I started the truck again, but did not drive off, just let it idle while I opened the message, reading each word. Slowly, the way you read something you already understand but want to confirm anyway. They had acknowledged the parcel number, confirmed the recorded easement existed in their system, and flagged the mention of a relocated survey marker as something that required immediate verification. That last part mattered, because survey markers are not suggestions, they are fixed points, and moving one without authorization is not a misunderstanding. It is a violation that pulls attention fast. I set the phone down on the seat and looked out through the windshield at the empty stretch of road ahead, sunlight cutting through the trees in long lines that shifted with the wind. And for the first time since I saw those spikes, everything felt predictable, not easy, not guaranteed, but structured, like a process that had already started turning. Another vibration, this time from code enforcement, a request for clarification on the roadway hazard I had referenced, and I smiled slightly because I had expected that too. I reopened the camera app, attached the clip of the workers laying down the metal strips, added a still image showing their placement across the full width of the driveway, and sent it back with a single sentence. Obstruction placed across recorded access route, visible in attached footage. Nothing more, nothing less. I knew better than to over-explain. The evidence speaks louder when you let it stand on its own. The third response took longer, close to 40 minutes, and when it came it was from the sheriff's office, not an officer, not a patrol unit, but administrative review, the kind that decides whether something stays a civil dispute or crosses into something else. I opened it, read the request for location confirmation, access points, and whether the obstruction was currently active, and I could almost hear the shift in tone behind the words, measured, cautious, but engaged. I typed back the coordinates, confirmed the gate was locked and the spikes remained in place, and then I added one more detail, the one that would anchor everything else. Easement provides sole access to residential structure, because that changes how obstruction is viewed, not inconvenience, but denial of access. I hit send and leaned back again, letting the engine run. Feeling the faint vibration through the seat, steady and constant, and I realized something that Victor had not considered when he stood there with his folder and his smile. He thought this was contained, a private extension of his authority, something he could manage within the boundaries of his community. But the moment he crossed that easement, the moment he altered that marker, the moment he laid those spikes across a recorded access route, he stepped into a system that does not care about confidence or presentation, only documentation and sequence. I picked up my phone again and opened the camera feed, watching the gate from a distance, still, quiet, unchanged, like it was waiting, somewhere behind it. I could see movement, a shadow passing near the posts, maybe Victor. Maybe one of the workers, still operating under the assumption that nothing had shifted yet. But it had, just not in a way you could see from 30 yards away. I checked the time again, 3:02 p.m., less than an hour since I had left that gate, and already 3 separate offices had touched the situation, logged it, started their part of the process. I put the truck in drive, pulled back onto the road, and headed toward town. Not in a hurry, not chasing anything, just moving forward the way you do when you know the next part is already in motion. Because from here on out, this was not about arguing at a gate or matching confidence with confidence. This was about what happens when a temporary claim runs into a permanent record, and that is not a contest that lasts very long. By the time I reached town, the late afternoon light had shifted into that soft, angled glow that makes everything look calmer than it really is, and I pulled into the county office parking lot without rushing. Just another truck among a dozen others, dust settling behind me as the engine clicked quietly under the hood. Inside, the air was cool and carried that familiar mix of paper, toner, and old flooring. The kind of place where things do not move fast unless they have to, but when they do, they move correctly. I walked up to the front desk, gave the clerk my name and parcel number, and watched her type it in, her eyes scanning the screen for a moment before she looked back up with a different expression than when I walked in, not surprised, not alarmed, just aware. "We saw your email," she said, and that told me everything I needed to know about how far this had already gone. She picked up a phone, spoke quietly to someone in the back, then motioned for me to wait, and I leaned against the counter, listening to the low hum of printers and distant conversations behind closed doors. A few minutes later, a man stepped out carrying a folder thicker than Victor's, older, worn at the edges, the kind of file that has been handled enough times to matter. He introduced himself as part of land records, shook my hand, firm and direct, then opened the folder right there on the counter. Inside were copies of the same documents I had sent, but official, stamped, backed by the system Victor had tried to bypass. He flipped to the easement, ran his finger along the recorded description, then nodded slightly, more to himself than to me. "This access route is clear," he said, "and it is not subject to private modification." And there was no emotion in his voice, just fact. He turned the page to the survey map, then paused, his finger hovering over the marker location before shifting to the updated coordinates I had referenced. "If that marker has been moved," he continued, "we will need to verify on site." And again, not dramatic, just procedure. I told him what I had seen, kept it simple, no assumptions, just placement, distance, condition of the soil, and he listened without interrupting, then closed the folder with a soft thud that sounded final in a way Victor's papers never could. "We will flag this for immediate inspection," he said, and then added something that carried more weight than anything else so far. "Code enforcement and the sheriff have already been looped in." And there it was, confirmation that the pieces were connecting exactly the way they should. I thanked him, turned, and walked back out into the fading light, the air cooler now, the breeze stronger through the open space of the lot. And as I got back into my truck, my phone vibrated again, this time with a short message from code enforcement. "Inspector dispatched, ETA within 24 hours. Followed by another from the sheriff's office, even shorter, "Case logged, monitoring status." And I set the phone down on the seat and let out a slow breath I did not realize I had been holding. This was no longer something contained behind a gate in the woods. It had a record number now, a timeline, multiple offices tracking it from different angles, each one responsible for a piece Victor had assumed nobody would check. I started the engine, pulled out of the lot, and headed back toward the cabin, not to confront, not to argue, just to be present, because timing matters when things start moving like this. As the road narrowed and the trees closed in again, I could feel the shift, subtle but real, like a structure settling into place after the foundation has been corrected. Victor still had his gate, his spikes, his sign, but those were surface details, temporary installations sitting on top of something much older and much stronger. And now that foundation had been acknowledged, documented, and set into motion, I rounded the final bend and slowed as the driveway came back into view. The metal teeth still catching the last of the sunlight, the sign still hanging where he left it, unchanged, unmoved, like it had no idea what was already on its way. I parked a little farther back this time, about 50 yards from the start of the spikes, leaving enough distance to see everything without stepping into it. And I cut the engine, letting the quiet settle in again, heavier now, like the air itself was waiting. The gate stood exactly where it had been, the sign still bright against the fading light. But something felt different, not in what I could see, but in what I knew was already in motion. I stepped out slowly, boots pressing into the gravel, and walked just close enough to the edge of the metal strips to study them again. Their placement too precise to be careless, too deliberate to be temporary, and I crouched, not touching them this time, just observing, memorizing angles, spacing, everything that would matter when someone else stood here and asked the same questions. A faint crunch sounded behind the gate, and I looked up to see Victor stepping into view from the side of the cabin, his posture tighter than before, his expression less polished, like he had already felt something shift even if he did not understand it yet. He stopped a few feet behind the bars, keeping his distance, but his voice carried through clear enough. "You came back," he said, and there was a different tone there now, not as smooth, not as certain. I nodded once, hands at my sides, relaxed, not challenging, just present, and let him continue. He lifted the folder again, but this time he did not open it right away, like even he knew it did not hold the same weight anymore. "We are moving forward with the expansion," he said, slower now, choosing each word, "and this area will be secured until everything is finalized." And I could hear it in the way he said finalized, like he needed that word to carry more than it actually did. I glanced past him toward the cabin, the porch still the same, the railing my grandfather built still catching the last light, untouched by whatever he thought he was doing out here. And then I looked back at the gate, at the chain, at the hinges anchored into fresh concrete that had not yet had time to fully cure. "You poured those footings today," I said, not asking, just stating it. And he hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, almost defensively, like progress itself was proof of ownership. I let that sit there between us, then added quietly, "That matters." And I watched his eyes narrow slightly, trying to figure out why. The wind picked up again, carrying a colder edge now as the sun dipped lower. And somewhere in the distance I could hear a vehicle on the main road, faint, steady, moving closer then fading. Again, the kind of background sound you do not notice until everything else gets quiet. Victor shifted his weight, finally opening the folder, flipping to the same colored map, holding it up like it could still anchor him. But now I saw it for what it was, not authority, just paper. "You should not be here," he said again, but the words landed differently this time, lighter, like they were already losing ground. I did not argue, did not step forward, did not reach for the gate. I just stood there, looking at him, at the setup he had built, at the confidence he was trying to hold on to, and I realized something simple that changed everything about this moment. He thought this was the confrontation, that this was where the outcome would be decided, between the two of us, at this gate, with his documents and my presence. But that decision had already moved past him hours ago, into offices, into records, into systems that do not respond to tone or posture. I checked my watch, not for show, just out of habit, noting the time, letting it settle into memory, then looked back at him and gave a small nod, not agreement, not surrender, just acknowledgement of where we were standing. "You will want to keep this area exactly as it is," I said, calm, even, and I saw the question form in his expression before he could stop it, the first real crack in that controlled exterior, because he did not know what was coming next, only that something was. I turned then, stepping carefully back from the edge of the spikes, each movement deliberate, unhurried, and walked back toward my truck without another word, leaving him there behind his gate, holding on to something that had already started to come. apart in ways he could not yet see. I did not go home that night, not all the way. Instead, I stopped at a small turnout about a quarter-mile down the road where the trees opened just enough to give me a clear signal, and I sat there with the engine off, the last of the daylight fading into that deep blue that comes right before full dark, and I watched the live feed on my phone. The gate was still there, the sign still hanging straight, the spikes still lined across the gravel like they had been measured with a ruler, but now there was movement behind them. More than before, figures passing back and forth, headlights cutting through the trees for a moment and then disappearing, like Victor was trying to get ahead of something he could not see. I leaned back against the seat, the fabric cool against my shoulders, and let the quiet do its work, because this part always feels slow even when it is not, the space between action and consequence, where nothing looks different, yet everything has already shifted. Around 7:18 p.m., a new notification came through, this one from code enforcement, not just a message, but an update with a case number attached, and I opened it immediately, reading the line twice to make sure I caught it exactly. Preliminary review indicates potential unauthorized obstruction and safety violation, site visit scheduled, and below that, a time window for the following morning. I exhaled slowly, watching my breath fog slightly against the windshield as the temperature dropped, and I set the phone down for a second, letting that sink in. A case number means it exists now, not just in conversation, not just in an email, but in a system that tracks it, timestamps it, assigns responsibility to it. A few minutes later, another vibration, this time from land records, shorter, more direct. Marker verification requested, survey team notified, and I could almost picture the process unfolding. People pulling old plats, comparing coordinates, preparing to walk the line that Victor had assumed nobody would check. I picked the phone back up and returned to the camera feed, scrubbing through the last few minutes. And there he was again, Victor, stepping into frame with someone else, pointing toward the posts, gesturing toward the ground where the marker had been moved, his movements sharper now, less controlled, like he was explaining something that was starting to unravel even as he said it. The other man nodded a few times, then walked over to the edge of the driveway, stopping just short of the spikes, looking down at them for a long second before stepping back. And I could see it in the way he moved, cautious, uncertain, not the confidence of someone reinforcing a decision, but the hesitation of someone realizing they might be standing in the wrong place. The wind picked up again, stronger now, pushing through the trees with a low, steady sound that filled the gaps between everything else, and I sat there watching, not intervening, not calling, not stepping back in, because this was not my part anymore. My part had been the documentation, the timing, the placement of facts where they needed to be seen, and now the system was doing what it always does when something does not line up. Around 8:02 p.m., the lights behind the gate went out one by one, first near the cabin, then closer to the posts, until the whole area settled into darkness except for the faint reflection of the sign catching what little light was left in the sky. I checked the time again, letting the numbers settle in my mind, marking the progression without needing to say it out loud, and then I leaned my head back against the seat, closing my eyes for just a moment, not to rest, but to hold that quiet certainty in place. Somewhere back there, behind that gate, Victor was still holding on to the idea that this was under his control, that he had time to adjust, to fix, to explain. But what he did not understand yet was that the moment had already passed where that mattered. This was no longer about what he said or what he believed. It was about what had been recorded, what had been moved, what had been installed, and those things do not change just because someone decides they should. I opened my eyes again, looked down at the phone one more time. The case number still sitting there on the screen, steady, real, and then I set it aside, started the engine, and drove off into the dark, leaving the gate, the spikes, and everything Victor had built exactly where it was, because by morning, none of it would belong to him anymore. The next morning came in quiet layers of gray light, the kind that rolls in slow through the trees before the sun fully commits. And I was already on the road before most people in town had their first cup of coffee, the truck moving steady over the familiar turns, gravel crunching under the tires as I eased back toward the property. The air felt colder, sharper, carrying that early mountain stillness where every sound travels farther than it should. And as I rounded the final bend, I saw them. Before I even reached the edge of the driveway, Two county vehicles parked just off to the side, hazard lights blinking in a steady rhythm that cut through the calm like a metronome. I slowed, pulled in behind them, and shut the engine off, stepping out into air that smelled faintly of damp earth and fresh-cut wood, the kind of scent that tells you something has already been disturbed. Ahead of me, the gate still stood, the sign still hung, the spikes still stretched across the ground, but now they were surrounded by people who did not belong to Victor's version of this place. One of the inspectors was crouched near the edge of the driveway, measuring the placement of the metal strips with a tape measure, calling out distances to another who was writing everything down on a clipboard, each number spoken clearly, recorded without hesitation, like it was just another line in a report that had already started writing itself. A few feet away, a survey technician stood beside the relocated marker, a handheld GPS unit in one hand, the other pointing toward a printed plat map clipped to a board, comparing coordinates with the kind of focus that does not leave room for interpretation. I walked up slowly, not interrupting, just close enough to be present, and one of the inspectors glanced up, gave a small nod of recognition, and then went right back to his work, because at this point, acknowledgement was enough. Victor stood behind the gate, a few steps back from the bars, his posture stiff, his arms crossed tighter than before, the folder nowhere in sight, replaced by something else entirely. Uncertainty. He watched as the inspector finished measuring the spikes, then stood, brushing dust off his hands before speaking in a calm, even tone that carried clearly across the space. These are classified as hazardous obstructions on a recorded access route, and the words landed flat, factual, not an accusation, just a statement that did not need emphasis. Another inspector stepped forward, holding a printed notice, bright orange against the muted colors of the morning, and walked it up to the gate, attaching it directly to the center bar where the sign hung, covering part of Victor's claim with something that held more weight than any private declaration. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, but the message stayed clear: violation notice, immediate action required, removal of obstruction and unauthorized structures. The survey technician finished his comparison, then looked up and spoke quietly to the others, a short exchange that ended with a simple nod, confirmation without drama. I could see it in Victor's face now, the moment where understanding starts to replace assumption, where the shape of the situation shifts from something he controlled to something he was now inside of. He stepped forward, closer to the gate, his voice lower, more careful, asking questions that did not carry the same certainty as the day before, and the responses he got were measured, procedural, grounded in references he could not argue with. I stood there, just outside the edge of the spikes, watching the process unfold piece by piece, every detail documented, every angle accounted for. And I realized that nothing here needed force, nothing needed escalation, because the system itself was doing exactly what it was designed to do when something did not align with the record. The wind moved through the trees again, lifting the corner of the notice just enough to make it visible from where I stood, and I took a slow breath, letting the cold air settle in, because this was the turning point, not loud, not dramatic, just precise, and once something reaches this stage, it does not reverse, it only moves forward. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the place had completely changed, not in volume, not in chaos, but in direction, like everything that had been pointed one way was now turning back on itself. The inspectors moved methodically, documenting angles, distances, timestamps, each step recorded with the same calm precision they had started with, and the orange notice on the gate no longer looked like a warning. It looked like a boundary marker of its own, something official that did not ask for permission to be there. Victor stood just behind it, no longer pacing, no longer gesturing, just watching, his hands resting at his sides like he had run out of ways to position them. And I could see the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders had dropped slightly, the way his attention followed every word the inspectors said instead of trying to lead the conversation. One of them stepped forward again, this time speaking directly to him, outlining the next steps in clear, measured language. Removal of obstructions, restoration of access, potential penalties tied to unauthorized modification of recorded land features, and none of it sounded aggressive, none of it needed. 2. Because the authority was already established, Victor nodded once, slow, almost automatic, like he was processing each piece a second too late, and for the first time since I had seen him, he did not interrupt. The survey technician finished marking coordinates, placing a temporary flag near where the original marker should have been, bright against the muted ground, a visual correction to something that had been moved, and that small flag carried more weight than the concrete posts Victor had set the day before. I stepped closer, stopping just short of the spikes again, and one of the inspectors glanced toward me, then gave a brief confirmation. Access will be restored. Simple, direct, no timeline needed because the process had already started. I nodded back, not saying anything, because there was nothing to add. Everything that mattered was already in motion. Behind the gate, Victor finally spoke again, quieter this time, asking about timelines, about what could be done, about how to resolve it. And the answers he received were the same kind he had given me the day before, structured, procedural, not negotiable. And I saw it then, clearly, the moment where his certainty fully gave way to understanding. This was no longer his decision to shape. It was a situation he had to respond to. The wind moved through again, lifting dust lightly across the gravel. And one of the workers who had been there the previous day stood off to the side now, watching the inspectors. Instead of acting, his earlier confidence replaced by distance, like he did not want to be associated with what was being measured. I turned my attention back to the gate, to the chain, to the hinges, all of it still physically in place but already losing its meaning. Because once something is identified as unauthorized, it stops being a structure and starts being a liability. I could almost see the next steps lining up. Removal orders, follow-up inspections, documentation closing the loop that had been opened less than 48 hours ago. I took a slow breath, the cold air sharp in my lungs, and let my eyes move past the gate to the cabin beyond it, still untouched, still exactly where it had always been, unchanged by everything that had tried to surround it. Victor looked at me once more, not with the same confidence, not with the same dismissal, but with something closer to realization, and I gave him the same small nod I had before, not as acknowledgement of him, but of the situation itself. I turned then, stepping carefully back from the edge of the spikes that would not be there much longer, and walked toward my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots in that steady, familiar rhythm. And as I reached for the door, I heard the faint sound of tools being unpacked behind me, the beginning of removal, quiet, methodical, inevitable. I paused for just a second, hand on the handle, and let the thought settle in, not loud, not dramatic, just certain, because this had never been about who stood at the gate or who spoke the loudest. It had always been about what was real, what was recorded, and what could not be rewritten. I opened the door, climbed in, and as the engine turned over and the sound filled the space around me, I glanced once more through the windshield at the orange notice, the flags, the people moving with purpose, and then I shifted into drive, knowing that by the time I came back, the gate would be gone, the spikes would be gone, and the only thing left would be the line that had always been there, exactly where it belonged.